1 in 3 South African women will be at least once during their lifetime.
Where do I feel safe? I cannot answer that.
No way. You don't feel safe at home?
I am so tired of being afraid all the time.
As a South African woman, walking on the streets is not safe.
A woman is murdered every 3 hours in South Africa. That's 5 times higher than the global average for femicide. Those killed, there's a 56% chance that a woman will have been murdered by her own partner.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Today we are going to talk about an unsolved case, but in this case, the police suspect that this victim was murdered by someone that she knew, but the person who did it is still unknown. And will police ever solve this murder? We do not know. And sadly, this is not the first unsolved case that we have covered, and it will not be the last. But once we get to the end, let me know if you think that it was a lover scorned, a jealous friend, or someone that no one knew about. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are starting off by talking about a young lady named Leslie Brockbanks. Leslie Brockbanks was born on the 17th of December 1971. Her mom's name is Christine and her dad's name was Arthur Brockbanks. She and her brother Paul were both born in Britain, where the family then stayed for a while before they moved to South Africa in 1981, where they then moved to the southern suburbs of Cape Town. Leslie was described by her mother and people she knew as a fun, loving soul. She was approachable if you managed to break down the walls that she had put up. But once you got to know her, she was loving, caring, and just really, really pleasant to be around. But not only was Leslie sweet and kind, but she was incredibly intelligent, and during her school years, her grades were well above the national average, and even the Department of Education realized this, and they realized that she was an incredibly bright young lady. And because Leslie was incredibly bright, she moved to a higher grade than her peers, and she matriculated at the age of 16. And generally in South Africa, we matriculate when we are 17, turning 18 years old. So quite a bright young lady, and the high school that Leslie went was Plumstead High. So straight out of high school, Leslie decided that she wanted to be an investment banker, and she really wanted to work her way up this incredibly competitive corporate ladder. But because she was, remember, only 16 years old when she left high school, she was then thrown into this corporate jungle at a very young age, and she quickly knew that this was not the place that she wanted to be, and banking was not really her passion. So once she left the whole banking sector after a couple of months, when Leslie was 17 years old, she then started working at Liberty Life. And this is where Leslie will now stay for the rest of our story. She worked at Liberty Life for around 11 years. And Christine, who remember is Leslie's mom, she described her and Leslie's relationship as incredibly close-knit. They would often go out for lunches in the week with each other and then shopping on weekends because this is something that they both really enjoyed. But it seems from our readings that soon after Leslie started at Liberty Life, she then met a man named Pierre van Zyl, and these two really hit it off really quickly. And soon after they started dating, Christine, Leslie's mom, said that they got engaged quite quickly and then they got married. But I'm unsure if Pierre van Zyl was a client that came to Liberty Life or if he worked at Liberty Life with Leslie and just in another division. But it seems as though Leslie was of a higher position than Pierre was. But even though Pierre and Leslie were romantically involved and then they got married, there was trouble in paradise. And Christine would often say that Leslie's relationship with Pierre was quite tumultuous, but she would also say that all couples fight. But Christine would say that Leslie and Pierre stayed quite close to them when they first got married, and Leslie would often storm out of the house and head towards Christine and Arthur's home, her parents, and then stay there for a night or a couple of days because she just wanted to be away from Pierre. And this got even worse when Leslie and Pierre moved even further away from Christine and Arthur, where they then moved into the deeper south, and they then went to live in Fisher. But even though the couple really tried and they really tried to reconcile with their differences, they decided to separate in 2000. But Pia made it very clear that he was going to stay in contact with Leslie because Pia really relied on Leslie for financial support. She was the breadwinner within their relationship. But because Leslie was quite successful in her Liberty Life career, she would often travel to different provinces within South Africa to train people on different types of life insurance policies, as well as other things that the business was conducting at the time. And a place that she would travel to quite often was the Garden Route in the Western Cape, and specifically in George. And she was booked to go there in August of 2000 again, to the small town of George. And then on Monday the 28th of August 2000, Leslie was scheduled for a flight to George to lead a product-focused seminar at the Liberty branch. And while she was there, she would then check into a Protea hotel situated at King George Park. And the Protea hotel that Leslie chose to stay at, this was only in a 10-minute radius from both the airport and where she was having the conference. So she wanted to stay very central because she was going to fly out the next day and then go back to Cape Town. Hotel records indicate that Leslie checked in the hotel on Monday the 28th of August and was allocated room 205. And this was an outside suite that offered Leslie a lot of privacy. Nobody knows if Leslie left the room at any point after she checked in. The last time that Christine, Leslie's mom, ever heard from her daughter was on the 28th of August at around 8 p.m. And Christine would say to news agencies later on, quote, "I spoke to her that evening of the 28th. It was 8 o'clock, and we chatted, and she couldn't decide if she would go down for supper or study. That was the last time I spoke to my darling Leslie." End quote. While Leslie and her mom were talking on the phone and deciding whether she was going to go out for supper or not, according to the hotel records, on the same day, either before she called her mom or after she hung up with her mom, Leslie did receive one phone call from an outside source. And what happened was that someone called the hotel from outside of the hotel. They then called reception and they then asked to speak to Leslie in a specific room. Police would then later track this phone that they then tracked to outside of a restaurant a couple of kilometers away from the hotel. The phone call came from a phone booth situated on York Street, only 2.4 kilometers away from the Protea hotel that Leslie was booked into. Whoever made the phone call to Leslie on that night was routed from the hotel's reception to room 205, meaning that the person on the other end of the phone would have spoken to at least two people that evening, one being the man or woman behind the front desk and Leslie. And whoever made the phone call that night must have known that Leslie was in George, also that she was in room 205 unless they were told by the reception desk, and that Leslie hadn't gone out for supper or they knew what she was going to do at the time. And also that they knew that she was going to pick up this call and take the call from reception and not just hang up. And the only people apparently who knew about this was her mom and dad, her ex-husband, some work colleagues from Liberty because obviously she was sent there, and some close-knit friends at the time. Leslie's dad dropped her off at the airport and Pia was supposed to collect her. However, even though the couple was still close-ish at the time, Leslie's mom would say that the month of August was a very challenging month for the couple. And Leslie's mom would often say that Leslie would be at her front door a lot during that month because the couple was continuously fighting. And she also said, quote, her husband had been out the night before a function and returned home at 8 o'clock in the morning. That was the beginning of August 2000, and it got worse from there, end quote. And there were also reports that the day before Leslie left to George, that her and Pia met up to have dinner, and according to Pia, this was a way for them to reconcile their relationship. He was going to work on his apparent drinking problems, and the two of them would then get back together. But this was not according to Leslie, and Leslie didn't feel the same way. She would tell her mom that this meeting and the dinner that they had was a way for her to kind of say, okay, this is her closing remarks, this is her being done with it, and then her leaving to George the next day would really decide whether she wanted to be away from Pia or not, and this dinner was just there as a goodbye in case this is what she really, really wanted. But back to the phone call, we don't know who called, and police still don't know apparently, or they're not letting public records know. I also assume that at the time there was not a lot of CCTV footage that was there, but we also can't let the theory go. Maybe Leslie was calling a lover. However, her mom does dispute this because of their very close relationship. She said that Leslie would have most likely told her if she was dating someone new or even trying to pursue a relationship with someone else. But, we can't always say that our children or our loved ones will tell us everything that's going on in their lives. But the Protea Hotel is around a 30-minute walk from York Street or the specific phone booth, and it's only around a 5-minute drive in a car. But police believe that Leslie took the phone call because she knew who was calling. And another piece of this puzzle is that there were witnesses who walked past Leslie's room at the time. And it is incredibly disturbing what he heard and then the actions that followed after, which could be understood, but also to think about what could have been prevented is just absolutely mind-boggling. But there was a witness who remains unknown to this day, but he was described as a consultant from Klip River, a town in uThukela District Municipality in KwaZulu-Natal. And at the time, on this Monday evening, the 28th of August 2000, this unknown male or witness, when he was then walking past room 205, when he noticed that he looked at room 205's door, and he noticed that the door was slightly ajar, which kind of concerned him. He walked a bit closer to it, and he heard a woman say, quote, "You're hurting me, leave me alone, please let me go," end quote. He heard these faint cries of a woman crying, and his stomach absolutely dropped. He peeped his head in, he had a look around, he couldn't see anything, but he heard a faint, very, very faint noise coming from the bathroom door, which was closed. This man wanted nothing more to do with this. He then pulled his head back out of the door. He then went straight down to reception and reported it to the manager, to security, and to reception, who then all went up to room 205. But when they got there, they noticed that the door was closed, and hanging on the door was a sign of "Do Not Disturb." So the manager of the hotel is staring at this "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. And it is against privacy policies when they put the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door that they may not use this universal key just to open the door because someone else reported something in the hotel. And because this sign was on the door, the manager decided not to open the door. And this may possibly have caused Leslie her life, but we will never know if she had already passed on by the time that the sign was put on the door. But the manager then turned around, he looked at everyone, his staff, the security, and he said that no one must come and disturb room 205 for the rest of the night, and they must just leave them alone. So it's quite hectic to think about if you think about it that way with what we're going to get into next. But remember, Leslie was there for a conference. So when 10 o'clock the next morning came, she was supposed to be down in the lobby where she was going to meet a few people to then head over to the conference. But when she never arrived, her colleagues thought that this was incredibly weird because she was always punctual, and because she never arrived, they then alerted the authorities, and they also called Leslie's mom. People then called into the Protea Hotel. They were then worried, and also her colleagues went up to the front desk to report that she never came down. So the front desk then alerted management. Management then went on to conduct a welfare check on room 205. They then walked up the stairs. They then were about to knock on the door when they saw the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the handle. But this manager on duty at the time, which was not the same manager from the night before, this manager then took one closer look at this "Do Not Disturb" sign, and he noticed a very, very small blood smear on the sign. This he thought was more than enough probable cause to open the door with his universal key. So he then opened the door. He called out to Leslie. He called and he called. She didn't answer, and the room was very neat. The bed was still made, her stuff was still in her suitcase, and nothing seemed like there had been a struggle in the room. But he noticed this lingering sensation from the bathroom when he noticed that the door was closed, and he knew that he had to go into this room. So he then opens the door to the bathroom, and he's met with an absolutely devastating sight. Detectives were then called, and the first responder, his name was Clippy's Tehran. And Clippy said that the bathroom was absolutely flooded with Leslie's blood. Her body was found sprawled across the floor with several stab wounds to her neck, left arm, and chest. Leslie's killer had also struck her on the head at the time when her body was discovered, but they noticed that her head had been wrapped in cloth, which is very interesting because this murderer conflicted so many wounds to her body and beat her and stabbed her to death, but this person then took the time to wrap her body in cloth. But criminal psychologists believe that this is called the undoing, where murderers will murder the people that they wanted to, but because they have a close connection with the person that they've just murdered, they try to undo it by covering their head, and in their mind then they're not now killing the person that they set out to kill because they can't see their face. It's obviously not them. But clinical psychologists also believe that this is only done by people who have a very close relationship with the person. They're either romantically involved or they're very good friends. Then there's some kind of passion there. So if we follow this idea, it is reasonable to assume that Leslie knew her attacker. Could they have been in a relationship? Could they have been very close friends? We still don't know. But also, Leslie had to open the door to the person and allow them in. Maybe she didn't look through the people and she just assumed that this was maybe a client from the conference that she let in. But also remember, this was after 8 p.m. at night because she just got off the phone with her mom and she was still alive. This phone call, we don't know how long it lasted, but she started the phone call at around 8 p.m. So meeting with a Liberty client after 8 p.m., I don't know if that's very plausible, but it is still possible. Another interesting fact about this case is what was taken, and it was Leslie's diamond ring, her diamond necklace, and her black purse was taken from next to the bed. And this could have just been because the person was rushed and they may not have had a lot of time to steal whatever else they wanted to steal. But Leslie's laptop, her cell phone, and other valuables that were inside her bag were never touched. Investigators also combed through the entire crime scene and found no traces of any intruder. It must have been determined that the killer was either wearing gloves because there was no DNA, no fingerprints, and even on the Do Not Disturb sign, there was that blood smear, but there was no fingerprints on the Do Not Disturb sign, which we could probably then assume that if the assailant was wearing gloves, then this murder was premeditated, and whoever sought out to call Leslie that night was most likely there to murder her. Police did check Leslie's cell phone. That produced no leads. They also checked her laptop. It produced no leads. She was there for work and she mostly used her cell phone and laptop for work purposes. But also, if Leslie had a cell phone, maybe this person didn't know her that well if he or she called through the payphone. It's just very weird if they knew that she had a cell phone, why they never called herself. Maybe they also didn't want to be traced calling Leslie, so could be that as well. But then an eyewitness came forward to investigators and he said that the night that Leslie was murdered, he noticed something weird outside the hotel, and this may have been a worker at the hotel who notices these kind of things because he noticed that a Ford Bantam Bucky was parked outside on the corner of the hotel. And he said that this was incredibly strange because there was parking right in front of the hotel. Why would they park on the corner when no one else was parking? But investigators then turned their attention to this bit of information about the Ford Bantam Bucky because they thought that whoever would park their vehicle around the corner of the hotel out of sight and out of mind is most likely not wanting to park in the parking lot because they may have to produce some form of ID, they might be on camera then. So they went out of their way not to compromise their identity. People also reported who were near Leslie's room at the time that they saw a man in a hoodie and sweatpants leaving Leslie's room around the time of the murder, but it's unclear whether this was on CCTV footage within the hotel. But because of this little bit of information and because there was no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing, this case went cold very quickly. And when there is such a crime of such violence with not really much taken from the victim, people will often go to the victim's spouse or lover to ask questions. So Pierre was questioned about his whereabouts on the night that Leslie was murdered. And Pierre told investigators that the night that Leslie was killed, he was out delivering food to clients. And these clients were from a supplier that he worked for. And whether this alibi was ever corroborated, we still don't know. Pierre also said to police that he was at Cape Town International Airport on the Tuesday when he was supposed to pick up Leslie on the 29th of August at 2 o'clock. He said that he was there, he said that he waited, and Leslie never came. So he then assumed that Leslie caught a lift with a work colleague because she never arrived at the airport, and he then left. It's also unclear whether he tried to call her cell phone. Remember, she did have one, and cell phones might not have been that popular at the time, so maybe he didn't have one, but he knew which hotel she was staying at, but we still don't know whether he tried to call it or not. But police then never questioned Pierre van Zyl any further. And later on, after Leslie's death and after everything had been settled, Christine, Leslie's mom, revealed that Christine had a 1 million rand life insurance policy at the time. And remember, this was in the 2000s. That was a lot of money back in 2000. It's still a lot of money now, but you get what I mean. But if we take a step back and we think of Pierre van Zyl, Leslie's ex-husband, or estranged husband, it is possible to drive from Cape Town to George. It's far, but it's not that far. It's around a 5-hour drive. So if Pierre had left when Leslie left, he could have got there that night and he could have driven home the same night. He was only due to pick up Leslie at 2 p.m. the next day. And if she was murdered at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. the night before, he would definitely get back to Cape Town in the early hours of Tuesday morning with enough time to sleep, enough time to clean up, and then to drive to the airport to pick her up. Police never investigated Pierre van Zyl any further, and everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. But sadly, months turned into years and then decades without any movement towards this investigation. Sadly, Leslie's father, Arthur, developed cancer a few years after her passing, and in 2008 he passed away without finding closure of his daughter's death. And Christine, Leslie's mom, really believes that he actually passed away from a broken heart. But talking about Christine, she did end up remarrying, and she married a man named Ian Stewart. They then got married and they then left to the UK, where they still live now. Remember Paul, Leslie's brother? He was actually in the UK at the time that his sister was murdered. He then got the absolutely horrific phone call. He then got on the next flight to be with his family and support them. But Paul would end up marrying, and he now has 2 daughters with his wife. But even after all of these years, Christine, Leslie's mom, does not relent, and she still wants justice for her daughter. And every year on the anniversary of Leslie's death, she contacts the George Herald in order to get hold of someone to publish a story, in order to remind people that this case is still ongoing. And she does this in order for someone to maybe remember something that they forgot 20 years ago, or if someone wants to come forward and confess to what they have done, that they do. Sadly, Clippies, the investigator who was working on this case 20 years ago, has now retired. And as far as we know, no one has even looked at Leslie's case with some fresh eyes over the decades. And sadly, the case of Leslie van Zyl, like many victims of violent crimes in South Africa, remains unsolved. But that is today's case. Let me know what you think of it down below. It is incredibly sad, and my heartfelt condolences go out to the families involved. But I hope that one day Leslie does get closure, as well as her family. But let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope you're all staying well. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.